Thank you very much. Good morning, all. Unfortunately, I couldn't join live, so we've pre-recorded this session, and we will make it interactive by me presenting and the moderator asking questions. So today, we're going to talk about the impact of 3D printing on supply chains. The first thing I want to bring into memory is this technology. It's not a new technology. Some people think it's something from the last 5 or 10 years. It's not. Actually, it already exists since 1983, where in the first 27 years it was more or less used for rapid prototyping only. When a number of important patents expired, then suddenly the technology started developing much further. And for example, in 2010, the dental industry worldwide adopted 3D printing. NASA is already using it in space. In 2015, we were thinking of 3D printed houses and bridges. 2 years later, we already have a 3D printed bridge in concrete. In 2018, a steel bridge. And this year, we have the first 3D printed houses rented out. And we're now even talking about 4D printing of smart materials. So within the last 20 years, the development has been enormous. Now, before talking about the impact on supply chains, I want to talk about the impact of manufacturing. So with 3D printing, you need less capital investment because you need one machine that can produce all kinds of products. You can localize your production, simplify supply chains, which we'll talk about more in detail later on. It's a technology that supports lean and agile. Design improvements is an important matter. If you look at the picture only here, there's no way with another traditional manufacturing procedure, you can make items like this. Complex geometries, mass customization is an important one. So there might not be so much demand at this moment for mass customization or individualization because it's just too expensive. Like a tailor-made suit is more expensive than one you buy at the C&A. But when people know that you can make it for almost the same cost, that demand will certainly grow much more. Now, benefits of scale no longer apply because the factor labor is insignificant with 3D printing. The also good thing is if you decide to have your own machines, in case you don't have them fully occupied, you can work as a subcontractor for other producers, low volume items. And an interesting thing as well is that consumers who start to produce their own products might be becoming producers, or if you combine those words, prosumers. Now look at supply chains. Traditionally, you have raw materials. On the left-hand side, raw materials. You have companies who make parts and components. They're assembled somewhere at different locations in the world and then eventually sent to retailers or distributors. Now with additive manufacturing, of course, you still need raw materials, which typically are filaments or powders. But you can skip the manufacturing and assembly part. You can go to the 3D printing production part immediately, which can be done locally. As I said, labor costs are insignificant. So as you see, a whole step can be deleted and the need to source at other far-flung parts of the world is no longer required. Jones Lang LaSalle gave a nice picture here. So traditionally, you see the supply chains on the left. There's long lead times. They have high transportation costs. A lot of carbon footprint. You produce goods en masse and then you push them into the market, and you're producing them far away. Where with 3D printing, you can have a different model where you can produce locally. You produce on demand, so it's more like a pull than a push system. And on top of that, it makes you less vulnerable for all the disruptions that can happen along the way. We've all seen what happened when COVID hit us very hard. Lots of supply chains were disrupted. If you're using 3D printing, you produce locally. That will certainly have a lesser effect. Now, less inventory is required because you produce on demand. You have less nodes in your supply chain, less transportation, as I mentioned. Another important aspect is you produce less weight and you use less resources. So as a matter of sustainability, using less material, produce less weight, less energy, less transportation, less carbon footprint. It's all good for the environment. What many people don't realize is because of this technology, you can produce at difficult to reach places. For example, emergency recovery after an earthquake or a flooding. If you have your local machines there, you can produce those houses that people need so much, or equipment or parts that you're missing. You can produce at ships, which is already happening. Maersk, for example, has equipped its ships with 3D printers to already produce parts they need for their maintenance, so they don't have to wait until they enter a harbor. Offshore platforms, space stations. You see new suppliers emerging. Local print centers are emerging that have different 3D printing equipment, and they can produce for all kinds of customers. So 3D printing doesn't mean like I'm a producing company, now I need to produce myself. You can still produce what you do today, but have a new product, a better designed, more optimal designed product that you possibly can produce at a print center if you decide not to invest in machines yourself. And the prosumers, as we've mentioned before, consumers that produce themselves. It's not so much necessary for our Western world where you can just buy everything around the corner at Praxis or Gamma or Hornbach or whatever have you. But there's plenty of areas on the world where you don't have those shops, so you still need products. So prosumers, if we lose our Western viewpoint of the world, there's many areas where prosumers will become very prominent. Now, of course, 3D printing has an effect on logistics. You will have less import and export, more local production, so that means more employment in local areas. Less import duties for countries. So governments also need to think about what will this mean if they import a lot. Increased customization is an important part, so you will have large amount of small shipments. You might be able to ask higher prices for your products because you're able to enhance them to customer request. New supply chains will emerge, supply chains of raw materials, of filaments and of powders, liquids. Those supply chains are not very well developed at this moment. They're more or less controlled by the equipment manufacturers, but slowly you see separate supply chains emerging. You will see something like we call pallets in, parcels out. So with 3D printing, local production, you'll have less long-haul transportation, but you might have more short deliveries like the typical courier service deliveries. And you might see the three-party logistics providers are becoming producers. A beautiful example is the Port of Rotterdam, where they have a 3D printing lab, where they're actually 3D printing certified ship propellers, which is typically not something that 3D-party logistics providers do, but other ones who have been supplying to the automotive industry are now producing parts for the automotive industry. So you see a new role for the 3PL service providers emerging.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
You mentioned less import and export. Now there is this theory going on that no physical products will be imported or exported, but a 3D model will be imported, in the sense that, let's say you are an oil company and you have to replace a part in your production facility, then they send the 3D model and it's being printed locally. Now there are some talks about the fact that then you have to pay import duties or rights or whatever for those models. What can you tell something about that?
Well, you would have to pay for those models. So if you're an oil company in this case, typically the oil company contracts don't have any inclusions in there for those rights for the parts of those drawings of those parts. So those companies will have to buy in a different fashion. They might be buying physical parts now, but they need to negotiate already that they have the entitlement to ask for the designs as well, probably at a cost or at a fee, unless if you want to own that design. So you'll certainly have to pay for it. Now, the interesting question you ask is import and export duties for electronic files. Well, just to remind you of the European Union attempts to start taxing companies like Google and Facebook for electronic services they provide in Europe and profits they make in Europe. At this moment, it's not possible to do that. So I think eventually there will, something might come up, but I don't think the governments can really control who sends a file over the internet. So I think import duties and export duties, I don't really see that happening, but certainly there will be new terms of commerce emerging between companies and their buyers, who instead of asking for their parts, they will be asking for the blueprints.
Yeah, okay.
Quickly, So we always call disruptive innovation. Disruptive is one of those buzzwords very often misused. What it actually means is that the technology starts at the bottom of the market, not interested for the main users. The main users are still using the typical products that have always been there, the blue line here, and companies invest to make those products better and more expensive and more enhanced and more features. Think of your televisions, you know, from black and white to color to stereo to curved to 3D to Dolby Atmos to you name it. It's always, but it's still a television. And at a certain moment in time, people think, I don't want to pay so much money anymore for this technology. The old technology is good enough for me. Now, the red line here represents a technology that starts at the bottom of the market. It's not really good enough for the main users. And slowly, slowly, it gets better. The existing companies typically don't invest in technologies that nobody wants. They invest in stuff that people want. But slowly, this new technology is developing and getting better and better and better. And there comes a moment, you see these two green lines, where for the general public, people might say, this works for me, this is good enough. And at that moment, the established companies think, oh my goodness, what happens? We should do something about this. We should get in there and also start making these things. Typically, these companies are too late. Too late, they have a too high cost level in their organization. They're not innovative enough. They're not fast and lean enough to react, too agile enough to react, and they're out of business. I'll give you an example of once famous companies. We all remember their names. They all got disrupted, and the list is much longer than this. And some of these companies, you know, Yahoo was an internet company, Nokia was a mobile phone company, MySpace, RIM, remember everybody wanted a BlackBerry. They're almost gone. Yeah. So this is a typical example of company who didn't see it coming, reacted too late, and got disrupted by a new technology. So 3D printing typically by academics is considered a disruptive technology that's just as disruptive as the internet was. Nowadays, the internet is all around us. We don't know, our children don't even know about a world without the internet. I can still remember that we had, you know, 12K, 14K modems where you had to dial in. Nowadays, it's everywhere. So 3D printing is now a bit strange, a bit alien to some organizations. But if we look 10 years ahead, if we look back on today's date, we might say, we told you, this is going to happen. Now, one important thing is 3D printing is not going to replace mass production, but it will exist side by side with traditional manufacturing. But it enables new business models. Like, you know, the biggest companies in the world, Google, Facebook, those are companies that are using new technology. Without the internet, these companies would have not existed. And additive manufacturing is enabling these new business models as well. Intellectual property still has a huge concern. Our current laws and regulations are not properly covering 3D printing. It's built on the transition of physical goods, not the transition of ideas and drawings. And also think about quality. So if I buy a blueprint from you, and I'm gonna go to a 3D printing hub, have it printed, and I'm gonna use it, but I made some modifications, and then there's a breakdown. And who's responsible? The person who made it, the company who made it, the company who made the modifications on the design, the original blueprint manufacturer. It's quite unclear. A lot of standards have not been adjusted to accept 3D printing as an acceptable manufacturing process. So this is one of the reasons that in some industries, the adoption is not as great as we wish it would be. But you see the airlines industry, for example, have a big need for this technology because they can produce the same strength products that are much lighter, hence saving a lot of money on fuel. And you see that the standards are now starting to be amended to include this technology. Raw materials is still limited. A lot of engineers are resistant because they're used to produce their goods in this quality, and 3D printing might not have this particular steel or plastic available. They might have something else. So you need to re-look at your design and say, could we possibly use a different material to produce the same items? But this technology is still developing. From small parts to big parts. I read recently that now the American military is working with machines that have almost a cubic meter of print area. We're seeing new technologies emerging. We see them bigger, faster, All these things are developing. So a lot of companies that might still be thinking about, yeah, it doesn't work, I can't produce what I produce today. Think again, because that machine that's not available today might be available tomorrow or next year. You should be ready for that. Now, 3D printing is a disruptive technology, but 5 years ago, McKinsey surveyed manufacturers leaders, and the results were quite disturbing because 40% of them were unfamiliar with 3D printing, except for what they read in the newspaper. 1/3 said it's not relevant, maybe not relevant for their current business model, but it could be relevant for a new business model, or it could be relevant for a competitor that's going to push them out of the market. Remember the slides that I showed you with Xerox and Kodak? 5% believe it doesn't apply to them, which is possible, and only 10% thought it was relevant. Now, this is 5 years ago. I was just looking up if McKinsey repeated this survey. Unfortunately, they didn't. And I hope events like we're having today is going to generate more attention and more realization in the leadership of companies that this is a technology that can open a lot of new doors, a lot of new markets, but also if you don't brace yourself, your organization might be disrupted and might be out of business in 10 years. So definitely this technology is worthwhile thinking about, like the internet was. There were companies 10, 20 years ago that said e-commerce is nothing, not relevant to me. Look at V&D, for example. It's a company here in Holland, a famous company, 100 years old, is gone because they didn't make the transition fast enough. But 3D printing is a disruptive technology. And some older people in the audience might recall the sound what we just heard, a typing machine. When I started working so many years ago, we had to type everything on a sheet of paper. When we made a mistake, we had to start again. And this is something for the new generation that they can't even conceive. Same thing with 3D printing. This is a technology that is moving so fast. It is something that you need to embrace or brace. If you don't want to adopt it, at least make sure that your company is safe and will not be disrupted. That's the main message here. The effects on supply chains, the effect on business models is going to be huge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and your powerful enthusiasm. I do have a question, because you mentioned that in the supply chain there will be at least one step disappearing, more or less. But
Yes.
it requires, if you look at the 3D printing service bureaus or companies, they also have to look into the design of a product, the production, the materials, but also the post-processing, which is a very neglected item we often notice, and also in this conference it will be handled later on. So what do you think, what sort of companies should you become if you decide to become a 3D printing service bureau?
That's a very good question. So if you want to be a 3D printing service, if you just want to be a 3D printing bureau, so you have those machines and you ask your customers, please give me the design and we will produce it for you. There are a number of those organizations. I think that service offering is too limited, because the reason why your customers have decided not to invest in 3D printing themselves is probably because they haven't really embraced the technology yet. That means they also haven't really looked at, can I optimize my design? Can I change my design? Can I, instead of making 5 parts, can I make this out of 1 part? I don't have the scientific evidence for what my statement here, but my gut feeling says the 3D printing bureaus will more work for companies that are still thinking the traditional way, but they've realized 3D printing could add some value. So instead of making a lot of investments, let's give it to these companies. So I think if you really want to be a value-added company, you need to be able to modify designs so they become more suitable for 3D printing, and you really reap the value of 3D printing. Printing a standard product instead of making it in the old-fashioned way. The only reason why that is a good idea is if you're really in need of it, and otherwise you have to wait 3 months, because it will always be more expensive. But the big strength is in the optimization of the design. So I think the companies that can actually do that are the ones that are going to prevail. Now, the second part of your question was the post-processing. Typically, post-processing can be done with chemicals. It can be done just with the traditional way, with grinding or machining. There's plenty of companies who can do that. So I think it's something, if it is an activity that really have a lot of demand for, you can do it yourselves. Otherwise, I think as a 3D printing hub, you can subcontract those activities. There's plenty of availability, but I think the real added value would be in being able to redesign.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Robert, for your for this answer. That's clear, and also for your presentation. So it's unfortunate that you're not here, so that no one else can ask you questions. But I'm pretty sure that people who have seen your presentation and your mail address can ask questions directly to you. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next time.
My pleasure.